We continue to get reaction on President Ramaphosa's speech. Among other issues, the president promised to stretch the rand by looking into exempting essential food items from value-added tax. For this conversation, I'm joined by Isobel Frye, founder and executive director of the Social Policy Initiative. Isobel, thanks for your time. So let's start off with a number of issues that I'd like to talk about: current VAT exemption, proposed exemptions to the VAT list. Now, how effective have the current VAT exemptions on basic food items been in alleviating food security in the country?
Good afternoon, Hugo, and good afternoon to all viewers. It's a really good question because in a policy environment, if you're wanting to expand on a policy, you need to do a review of its efficacy. When we look at the poverty figures, and we're still waiting for current poverty figures, so the ones we're looking at are pre-COVID, we see that 25% of all South Africans fall below the food poverty line. So that means that they are not getting enough to eat to meet the basic World Health Organization standard for an adequate survival. Access to food is therefore critical. 2018, we saw one or two further items added to the exemption list for VAT. But we also need to recognize, Hugo, that for the majority of very poor people, the places where they buy food are more informal traders, and so VAT is not charged. And as a result, any relief on the VAT would not trickle down to the very people that need the most direct assistance. And that puts a big question mark into the kinds of policies that are being proposed.
Okay, so there are a number of items that are on this new list, extended list, if you will, and 6 items, including white bread, white flour. Sanitary pads is the one area that I want to touch on, because that doesn't actually speak to food, but it's one of those things that's critical to the girl child and to women across South Africa. How important is the addition of these extras?
The addition of sanitary pads is crucial for dignity for women, girl, children and women. That should go through without a debate whether it is a food item or not. And there was a public swell towards that a number of years ago. So I think that should go through. What I do want to touch on, Hugo, however, is that the question of tax and transfer. So if the state cuts VAT or exempts certain food items or items from VAT, it means that the tax take is less. The other way of giving relief to people is what's known as transfer, so from cash transfers, for instance. And we need to ask whether exempting certain prescribed goods, which some expert has decided are necessary for the basics of life, is a more effective way, one more aligned with dignity, than expanding the social cash grants and giving people the choice as to how they use it. The idea of the state identifying which food items the poor should eat really is incredibly paternalistic and very liberal. We know that the DA, for instance, is an aligned Liberal Party, and that question mark when the DA said that government is now adopting its policy. I think there is a thread of ideals that come through in that regard. We think that from the research that we've done at the SPI, a far more efficacious policy would be to look at expanding the value of, for instance, the social relief of distress grant, and so give people the choice as to how they want to spend that money and where. Because the social relief of distress grant, the 370 grant, is less than half the value of the food poverty line, which is that amount that the World Health Organization says that people need to survive. So we would really urge government, before they introduce the increase to VAT, to have a whole of government look at how the poverty alleviation strategy that the president spoke of is going to be implemented. And surely giving people the choice of how they spend the money is more in line with the right to dignity in the Constitution than advising people how the state decides that they should spend their money.
So when you talk about the social relief of distress grants and obviously increasing those numbers, it's fundamentally based on an economy that's firing on all cylinders, and that's not where we are. South African economy is not firing on all cylinders. But you've also talked to us about a situation where the government appears not to have consulted in coming up with what foodstuffs or what items will benefit from this subsidy, and at the very least engaged on what are the other possible mechanics that they can use to spread this sort of a subsistence, if you will, to those in need?
Absolutely. And when it comes to these choices, we need to recognize that a lot goes into it. So, for instance, you've got the scientific knowledge coming through, but you've also got cultural preferences. And if you look globally at the kinds of policy lessons learned, you have the best intended bureaucrats who decide on a certain way forward with the objective in mind to alleviating people's plights and improving the quality of life. And yet, because of the cultural practices, the people don't follow the intended actions. And so you have unintended consequences of failed policies. I think if we look at the list of the current exempted food goods from the VAT, it's quite shocking to realize that meat is not a significant item there. So how people eat, what kinds of ways in which they organize their lives really needs to be central in terms of any effective policy going forward.
I want to touch a little bit on just how genuine the government might be in all of this. And the reason I raise the issue is because there are multiple economic challenges, and we have to look at the elevated inflation and interest rates over the past 3 years. In fact, we have to go just, I think, almost 60 days ago to a huge increase in electricity, right? So electricity goes up. People cannot afford to buy electricity. And then there's what appears to be a token 15% VAT surcharge being removed from certain foodstuffs. I mean, is there a balance? Is there actually any benefit to consumers?
It's a really good question. It's the question of where the burden falls on a population in terms of both transfers, but also taxation. The president made mention of the need to introduce a poverty alleviation plan. Now, I was part of the drafting of one in 2006, which never went anywhere. I think that the reason why that's so important right now is we've seen poverty levels rise significantly. We see that 42% of the adult population is unemployed, and South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. That means that we have to look critically at the interventions that you mentioned earlier, Hugo, that our economy is not thriving. You've got two ways of looking at this. You can either say that we need to grow the economy and then that'll trickle down to the poor. Or you can say, let's look at stimulating the economy by pumping money in to the economy through the pockets of the poor. Now, you're probably too young to remember GEAR, which is the Growth, Employment and Redistribution Policy of 1996. And I say that flatteringly. But the fundamental challenge of that is that GEAR changed the assumption that we grow through redistribution. And instead it said we redistribute growth. So if there is no growth, there is no redistribution to the poor. The most effective way of inclusive growth that the president spoke about quite a lot are through wages. So when jobs are created, surplus and profits are distributed through wages. But when we see an ever increase in unemployment and a decrease in jobs, it means that those ways of trickling down are not happening. So the growth that does happen is actually increasingly exclusive. And so you get the concentration of money in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And that, to an extent, is why the economy is not growing. The economy is not growing because over 56% of South Africans fall below the poverty line. So they are not active consumers. We were quite devastated to see that alleviating poverty has dropped, and that was actually in the statement of intent of the Government of National Unity, from the number one priority to the second, the first one being economic growth. Because globally, research shows that where you have countries with incredibly high levels of income inequality, as we do, as a starting point, growth is retarded. Growth will not accelerate beyond a certain pace and level because you have so many people who are excluded from the sharing of it. We think it's a really important time for government to consult with non-orthodox, with heterodox economists globally as well as nationally, and say what are new ways that we can have in terms of bringing people into the economy. And the national dialogue, we think, would be a really good way to start. So we would caution government against introducing ad hoc and piecemeal policy reforms, which are quite populist in nature, such as the VAT. You seem to be placating people's concerns, but you're not doing it with a forward-looking all of government and all of the economy.
Well, Isobel, if you allow me to come in there, because you raise a key issue, and that's obviously engagement and looking at measures, looking outside the box. Now, the Social Development Minister, Sisi Talashe, has said in her budget speech a few days ago that she would like to fill critical posts in her department, finalise key pieces of legislation, and continue supporting vulnerable individuals despite fiscal constraints. Now, from that statement, it doesn't look like she's trying to play outside the box. It all seems we've done this before, were we going to keep doing it, even if it doesn't give us the results that we're looking for? Is this an opportunity for the new minister to engage?
Absolutely. Hugo, if we look at the multi-year budget for the outer years of the 3-year budget, we see that next year the social relief of distress line item disappears entirely. So 76% of the relief that goes to working age people disappears, and there is no contingency that's been put in place. That's incredibly ominous in its warning. Now, we've heard from the Minister of Finance, as well as the President over the weekend, that there are plans afoot to reconfigure some kind of income transfer to working age people. But you're right, the Minister made no mention of it. She seemed to be referring back to the more welfarist approaches, which the department needs to do, looking at the vulnerable, at orphans, at older people. But that line department has also been given the constitutional mandate of social security, of ensuring basic income. And despite 30 years of seeing the vulnerability of working age people getting more and more profound, we have no new solutions on the table. Now, we're part, I'm sure you know, of a coalition of civil society organizations calling for a decent universal basic income. And at the SPI, we've done research that shows that with a 1,500 Rand to everybody, tax back from you and I who are working, we can actually grow the economy by up to 6% and create 2 million decent jobs in 3 years. Now, that's the kind of research that we really think the state needs to be looking at, not what it has done in the past. We also are very encouraging of the concept of piloting, because South Africa is on the extreme of so many of the measurement dimensions. The tried and tested policies done in other parts of the world are not necessarily going to have the intended consequences. So before we roll out national programs, let's try different aspects. I mean, if we wanted to get people back into work, will a job seekers allowance assist, or will it bring up unintended consequences? Will getting free data to people maybe enable them to know where jobs are, for instance, rather than putting their names onto unemployed transfers? So there are so many different dimensions in different parts of the country as well. Piloting is a way of saving money, getting up-to-date and incredibly accurate policies to address the problems that we have, which are exacerbating with time. By the end of this administration, we could, as you said at the beginning of this interview, do things entirely differently, or we could have regressed in terms of growth, in terms of all our development measurements, because we're just doing the same old things. And the other point is that when you have coalition governments, there is globally evidence to show that policies become more right of center as people try and find a common denominator. Now, the ANC was more social democratic. We see that there might be a reluctance to move to the left of their previous positions. The state of South Africa is such that we need to be explosive in terms of ensuring that policies meet people's needs where they are, not where we would want them to be or where they are in different parts of the world. And the new administration has the opportunity to bring the best of different thinking together through the consultation that you refer to, through the national dialogue. And we do hope that Parliament also steps up and that the portfolio committees become charged engines where the best is negotiated and dealt out, rather than becoming staid attempts to justify executive mistakes, as might have been done in the past.